Beloved, there's a specific ache that comes with loneliness that no other pain can quite match. It is not the loud grief of loss, nor the sharp sting of betrayal. It is the quiet, persistent heaviness of feeling unseen, unheard, and set apart in a world that seems to move in groups while you stand watching from the outside. You have sat in rooms full of people and felt completely invisible. You have scrolled through celebrations of others, wondering why your phone stays silent while there's buzzes with belonging. You have reached out, extended yourself, tried to fit into circles that never quite made space for your shape, and eventually you stopped trying. Not because you gave up on love, but because the exhaustion of being misunderstood became heavier than the fear of being alone. And in the silence that followed, you questioned everything. You wondered if there was something fundamentally wrong with you, if you were too much, if you were not enough, if the absence of a crowded life meant the absence of a meaningful one. You watched others build their tribes, their families, their networks of support, while you learned how to carry your own burdens, celebrate your own wins, and nurse your own wounds without a single witness. It felt like abandonment. It looked like failure. It tasted like bitterness on the nights when the silence was so thick it seemed to press against your chest. But listen to me now, and listen with the ears of your spirit, because what I am about to speak over you will lift the weight of years from your shoulders. God says, He kept you lonely for a reason, and now you will finally understand why. This was never rejection. This was selection. There is a dangerous myth in the world that says you are only as valuable as the number of people who claim you, that your worth is measured by invitations, by group chats, by how many hands reach for you when you fall. But heaven operates on a different economy, and sometimes the most protected people on earth are the ones who spend seasons walking alone, not because they are unlovable, but because they are uncontainable, not because they are broken, but because they're being prepared for a container that has not yet been built. You see, when God has a specific work to do through a life, He often begins by removing the noise. And noise is not just sound. Noise is the energy of the crowd, the pressure to conform, the subtle compromises that come with belonging. The way a group can slowly convince you that your edges are too sharp, your light is too bright, your standards are too high, until you sand yourself down to fit into their comfort. God looked at your future, and He saw that if He allowed you to settle into the wrong circles too early, you would have dimmed your own fire to keep them warm. You were too sensitive for the environments you were trying to enter. Your spirit was too porous. You would have absorbed their fears, their limitations, their small thinking, and mistaken it for your own. So He did something that looked cruel from the outside, but was actually the deepest mercy. He withdrew you from the table, not as punishment, but as protection. He allowed the invitations to stop coming. He allowed the friendships to fade into silence. He allowed the connections you tried so hard to maintain to slip through your fingers like sand, no matter how tightly you try to hold on. And while you were crying in the bathroom at 3 a.m, wondering why nobody chose you, He was choosing you for something that required a level of solitude you did not yet understand. This is the mystery that has been hidden from you. The loneliness was never about your lack. It was about your call. You were being set apart, not set aside. There's a difference between being discarded and being reserved. A discarded thing has no value. A reserved thing is kept back because its value is too high for common use. You were reserved. Every season of isolation was a classroom where God taught you how to hear His voice without the interference of other people's opinions, where He taught you how to validate yourself without the applause of the crowd, where He stripped away the need for external permission until you became dangerous with independence. Because here is the truth that will set you free. The people you were grieving, the circles you were trying to penetrate, many of them were actually anchors disguised as lifeboats. They would have kept you in shallow waters when you were built for the deep. They would have celebrated your smallness and been threatened by your expansion. And God loved you too much to let you become a prisoner of their approval. So He isolated you, not to break you, but to build you into someone who could stand in the fire of their destiny without needing someone to hold their hand. There were specific lessons you learned in that isolation that the crowd could never have taught you. You learned the sound of your own voice. Not the version you perform to be accepted, but the raw, unfiltered truth of who you are when nobody is watching. You learned that you could survive your own thoughts. That your company was not something to escape from, but something to cultivate. In the silence, you stopped performing and started becoming. You discovered that you had opinions that differed from the groupthink you were trying to adopt. You found boundaries you didn't know you possessed. You developed a discernment so sharp that now, within moments of meeting someone, you can feel whether their energy is adding to you or extracting from you. That is a supernatural gift, and it was forged in the fire of having nobody else to rely on but the presence of God. When you have no one to call at midnight, you learn that the divine is always awake. When you have no one to validate your decisions, you learn to trust the inner witness that whispers. This is the way, walk in it. When you have no one to share the meal with, you learn that the provision is still enough, that the table is still abundant, even when set for one. You became spiritually self-sufficient, and that self-sufficiency is what makes you unshakable now. Consider what would have happened if you had been surrounded by the very people you begged God to give you. You would have been too distracted to hear the warnings, too entangled to move quickly when he said, now, too afraid of their judgment to obey the strange instructions that were preparing your future. The crowd demands consistency, but God was calling you to transformation. And transformation is messy. It requires shedding. It requires days where you don't show up the same way you did yesterday. It requires the freedom to contradict who you used to be without explaining yourself to people who love the old version of you because she was easier to control. God kept you lonely because he was doing radical surgery on your soul. And surgery requires a sterile environment. No contamination. No outside hands touching the open wound while it is healing. You were in recovery, and the isolation was the ICU where the great physician could work without interruption. While others were gathering to gossip, you were gathering wisdom. While others were building networks, you were building depth. While others were learning how to play politics, you were learning how to rule with spiritual authority. And now, the contrast is becoming clear to you. You see how easily you could have been seduced into smallness. How quickly you would have traded your prophetic edge for a seat at a table that was already full of compromise. You were not left behind. You were pulled back, like an arrow being drawn further from the target, so that when you're finally released, you will fly past every limitation that tried to define you. The loneliness created a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. So into that empty space, into that loneliness, God poured himself. He poured his thoughts, his strategies, his secrets, things he does not whisper in crowded rooms, because the noise drowns out the frequency. You were given access to the upper room while everyone else was fighting for position in the courtyard. And that is why your perspective shifted. That is why you no longer crave what they crave. That is why the things that excite the masses now feel hollow to you, because you have tasted the bread of heaven and the junk food of superficial connection no longer satisfies your hunger. You are being prepared to carry a weight of glory that would crush someone who still needs constant validation from 5 different people before they make a decision. You are being shaped into a container, and containers must be emptied before they can be filled. God emptied you of the wrong associations so he could fill you with himself. And when a person is full of God, they become dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. They become unpredictable. They cannot be manipulated by the fear of rejection because they have already survived the worst of it. They cannot be bought with inclusion because they have already learned that their belonging is not negotiated with humans. It is inherited from the divine. Beloved, the page is turning now. Not with the slow reluctance of past chapters that seem to never end, but with the sudden snap of divine timing finally aligning with your preparation. You have been wondering when the loneliness would lift, when the silence would break, when the proof would arrive that this season had meaning after all. But I need you to understand something before the breakthrough comes crashing in, because if you do not understand the reason why you are still in the final moments of waiting, you will squander the very purpose for which you were held back. So listen with your whole heart now. The reason God kept you lonely was not simply to heal you. It was to make you a healer. It was to position you as a conduit of power that could only be forged in the absolute absence of human interference. There are frequencies of glory that cannot be downloaded in crowded rooms. There are depths of authority that can only be excavated when you have been stripped of every prop, every crutch, every voice that would echo back your own limitations. You were not being punished with solitude. You were being weaponized by it. And now, the weapon is ready. Look at your hands. Do you see how steady they are now? There was a time when they shook with the need to text someone, anyone, to validate your existence. Now, they're steady enough to lay hands on the broken and not absorb their poison. There was a time when your eyes scanned every room looking for a familiar face to save you from the terror of being seen alone. Now your eyes are clear enough to see the invisible armies surrounding you and the broken hearts hiding behind the masks of the confident. You have been given night vision in the darkness, and that is why you can no longer fit where you once begged to belong. You have outgrown the small tables where you once starved for crumbs of attention, not because you are arrogant, but because your spirit has expanded beyond the capacity of their containers. And here is the revelation that will break the dam inside your chest. The loneliness was never about you being unwanted. It was about you being unclaimed, so that you could be fully claimed by the one who needed you empty of competing loyalties. God did not withhold community from you because you were unworthy of love. He withheld it because you were becoming too dangerous to remain in the cages of their understanding. They would have loved you into smallness. They would have comforted you out of your calling. They would have handed you mirrors that reflected their limited perception of who you should be. And you, hungry for connection, might have believed them. So he removed the mirrors. He removed the noise. He removed the well-meaning voices that would have talked you out of the wild obedience your future requires. And in that brutal, beautiful emptiness, you found him. Not the God of the group chat, not the God of the committee meeting, not the God of the polite Sunday service, but the God of the burning bush, the God who speaks in whirlwinds, the God who is not safe, but is good. You have been touched by fire, and now everything about you is altered. You walk differently. You speak differently. You love differently, because you know, with a knowing that goes deeper than doctrine, that you are absolutely never alone. You carry the presence that filled the void, and that presence is not a comfort blanket. It is a consuming fire. So when the invitations start coming again, and you will not arrive as the beggar you once were. You will arrive as the benefactor. You will not come looking to be filled. You will come overflowing. You will not come seeking validation. You will come bearing validation for others who still bleed from the same wounds you survived. The tables are turning. You who were once the one not invited will become the one whose presence is requested by those who sense that you carry something they have lost. But you must be careful now. Do not rush back into the arms of the familiar just because the loneliness aches. You are not being released to go back to who you were. You are being released to establish something new. Your loneliness was the price of your anointing. And now that the oil is on your head, you must steward it. Do not give your sacred self to those who still play games with holy things. Do not trade your depth for their distraction. You were kept apart so that when you finally walked among them again, you would walk as a king among commoners, not in arrogance, but in authority, not to dominate, but to liberate. You're being sent back into the crowd as a secret agent of heaven. But you must never forget the training you received in the desert. You must never forget the sound of the silence that taught you his voice. You must never again believe that your worth is measured by how many people surround you, but by how fully he fills you. So, here is your commissioning. Go now and look for the others, the ones sitting alone at the edges of rooms, the ones who smile, but their eyes are hollow, the ones who have been ghosted by the world and are starting to believe they are ghosts themselves. You will recognize them because you bear the same scars. And when you find them, do not offer them the cheap comfort of cliches. Offer them the testimony of your survival. Tell them, I know. Tell them, I was kept lonely for a reason, and so are you. Tell them, the silence is not empty. It is full of him. You are the proof that abandonment is often divine redirection. You are the living evidence that isolation is sometimes the cocoon of transformation. You are the witness that God does not forget his own, even when his own feel forgotten by everyone else. And as you go, know this deep in your bones. You were never a mistake. You were never an afterthought. You were never the one left out of the plan. You were the plan, kept lonely, so that when you finally stood among them, you would stand as a lighthouse, not seeking the shore, but guiding the ships safely home. Now you understand. The loneliness was the love too fierce to explain. The silence was the preparation too sacred to interrupt. The waiting was the waiting, the adding of substance to your spirit, so you could carry the glory without collapsing. You are released now, but you are not returning as the victim. You are returning as the victor. Walk in it, own it, and never, ever apologize for the depth that loneliness carved into you. It is your crown. Wear it. Amen.